Hello again. This is the second of three videos on the chemistry of life, which is chapter 2 in your textbooks. And so today, or in this video, we are going to talk a little bit about the first two biological molecules that we began talking about in the last video. Now, remember that the last thing we talked about was the idea of taking these very large molecules and breaking them down into building blocks, all right, distributing them throughout the body, and then putting them back together in a form that we want, okay? So the first molecule that we're going to talk about here are the carbohydrates, all right, the first of four. And carbohydrates are made of subunits called monosaccharides. And the most common monosaccharide, the one that we use most frequently in our cells, is called glucose. You may have heard that term before, all right, glucose. Now, remember that the organic elements are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And specifically, the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen atoms is 2 to 1. What that means is, and that's where the name hydrate, or the part of the name hydrate, comes from. H2O, right? 2 to 1 ratio. All right. And obviously the carbo in the beginning represents the carbon atoms. So carbohydrates, CH2O. So anytime you see a molecule that's got the ratio of 1C, 1 carbon, to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, that's a carbohydrate molecule. Now, the function of carbohydrates in most organisms is a short-term energy molecule, quick energy, all right? If you've ever given a 4-year-old a bag of M&Ms, all right, and then, 5 minutes later, they're bouncing off the walls, all right, well, that's why, all right? Those carbohydrates, those simple sugars, are broken down very quickly, enter the cells, and they give you a great deal of energy. Now, carbohydrates are found in two major forms: simple carbohydrates, which are very small, usually 1 or 2 subunits, a monosaccharide or perhaps a disaccharide, and then complex carbohydrates, which have long chains of many glucose molecules or some other simple carbohydrate, all stuck together in a very long chain. All right, so simple and complex. Let's look at some examples of simple carbohydrates. All right, this represents, in the top picture here, this represents a glucose molecule. Notice that the ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen is 6 to 12 to 6, which, if you think about it, reduces to 1 to 2 to 1. Now, all three of the molecules in this top picture are the same. All right, these are just different ways that organic chemists can represent an organic molecule. Notice in the first one, every single atom is shown. There's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. In the second molecule shown, they've eliminated most of the carbons. They just kind of draw them as a point there, and it's assumed that you understand that there is a carbon molecule, carbon atom there. And then in the third one, both the carbons and the oxygens have been removed. The carbons and the hydrogens have been removed. And so it's a very simple way to draw the molecule. Now, we also consider disaccharides to be simple sugars, all right? And this is an example of a disaccharide called maltose here. And it's simply 2 simple sugars that are stuck together here with a small bond, all right, a bond, an oxygen bridge, if you will. All right, so it's the monosaccharides are 1 ring of carbon molecules with all the carbon atoms with all the other associated atoms. A disaccharide is simply two carbon rings with all of the other associated atoms. All right, and so this molecule is maltose. Now, other examples of monosaccharides include fructose, all right, which is a fruit sugar. You may have heard the term high fructose corn syrup, all right? That fructose is the sugar that you typically find in fruit. Galactose, all right, which is the sugar that you find in milk, all right, is also a simple monosaccharide sugar. The sugar that you put into your coffee in the morning, table sugar, that is a disaccharide called sucrose. And it's actually a combination of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. So it's got both of those monosaccharides tied together to form a disaccharide. Now, complex carbohydrates are obviously more complex. They are simply long chains of glucose molecules that are all bonded together. All right. And how do we put them together? Right, by dehydration synthesis. In any event, once you get more than 2 or 3 of these things in a row, we begin to call them polysaccharides. The prefix poly simply means many, and saccharide means sugar. So a polysaccharide is a many sugared molecule. And so it's made of many different carbon rings. There are 3 forms of polysaccharides that I want you to know about, but there are many, many others as well. The most important one for animals is the storage molecule glycogen. When we store sugar, we generally store it in our livers, and we take a bunch of glucose molecules, bond them together by dehydration synthesis, and store them in the liver in the form of glycogen. Plants will store their carbohydrates, their simple sugars, as starch. Okay, and think about, starch is simply the storage form in plants. There's also a structural form of polysaccharide in plants called cellulose, which is a structural form, gives it strength and form. Now, think about when you eat something like a potato, right? And there's a nice little drawing of a potato right here. That when you open that potato up and look inside the skin, most of what you are looking at is starch, okay? And so when you eat a potato, all right, that polysaccharide is then digested by your body into many, 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 many monosaccharides. And the monosaccharides themselves are then used for short-term energy inside your cells. Now, cellulose, interestingly enough, is not digestible by the human body. And so we take it in, but we pass it right through. And not to be gross or anything else, but most of what you poop out is cellulose, all right? The plant material that is indigestible but necessary in your diet. It adds bulk to your feces. It helps to bind cholesterol. It does a number of different things, but mostly it is not digested. It's literally passed right out of the body. The second major form of organic molecule that you need to be aware of are lipids, all right? Oftentimes we refer to these as fats, but they come in multiple different forms, which we'll get to in a second. Now, lipids are different than carbohydrates, but they are still composed only of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right, so carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. No nitrogen, phosphorus, or sulfur. The difference between a lipid and a carbohydrate is that there's no 2-to-1 ratio between the hydrogens and the oxygen. Fats are also, or lipids, are also used as energy molecules. All right, but fats generally are stored energy molecules. They're for long-term energy as opposed to the short-term energy. They also, because of their chemical structure, do not dissolve in water. If you've ever washed a sink full of greasy dishes, the grease is a form of lipid. Now, There are four major kinds of lipids that we'll talk about over the course of this course. The nutrient types are fats and oils. Fats, generally speaking, are, we'll talk about the difference between them in a minute. Phospholipids are found in cell membranes, all right? So that's when we talk about phospholipids in chapter 3, and we talk about cell membranes in chapter 3, you'll see that they are, that cell membranes are mostly phospholipids. And then last but not least, we have the last form is steroids, which are a form of lipid that are used for a variety of different things in the human body, including as hormonal messengers. Now, in terms of nutrients, fats and oils are very different. Fats, generally speaking, are usually animal in origin. They are solid at room temperature because they are what we call saturated. And what that means is that every carbon is bonded to the maximum number of hydrogen and other carbon atoms. Now, that makes them solid because because they tend to be linear molecules, they tend to stack one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, and that allows the fat to solidify. Think bacon when you're talking about this. Think about the fat on a steak or some other piece of meat. All right, these are solids at room temperature. Again, their function is for long-term energy. They also provide insulation from heat loss and cushioning for the organs inside. So fat's not necessarily a bad thing, at least not in excess. Oils, on the other hand, are typically plant-based. Right? They come from plants. And the major difference is that they are unsaturated molecules, meaning that they tend to bend at weird angles, and so they can't lay flat on one another, which keeps them spaced out and therefore liquids at room temperature. All right, think about vegetable oil, corn oil, olive oil, and those kinds of things. All right, liquids at room temperature. All right. Now, the structure of fats and oils is like this. There are only four building blocks. All right, you've got three fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. Now, glycerol is a kind of alcohol, not the alcohol that you drink or put on your skin, used for rubbing alcohol, all right, but a different form of alcohol, and three fatty acids. Now, if you look at this group on the end of the fatty acid, that's the acid group. All right, that's why we call these things fatty acids. And if you take a glycerol and the three fatty acids and you remove, notice hydrogen, hydrogen, and hydrogen here, hydroxide, hydroxide, hydroxide here. So we get through a dehydration reaction, we produce 3 molecules of water, and then we glue the fat molecule together. So this is not a molecule that has many different parts, just 4. All right, whereas a carbohydrate can have hundreds or even thousands of glucose molecules all stretched out in a row. Of course, when we break the fat molecule down, we go through a hydrolysis reaction and break it back down into the glycerol and fatty acids. The last thing I want to point out on this molecule, these molecules, is the difference between saturated and unsaturated. The top 2 fatty acids in this picture are saturated. Notice that every carbon has bonds, 4 individual bonds to either another carbon or a hydrogen. This one is an unsaturated fatty acid because 2 of the carbons are bonded twice to one another. All right, so that's an unsaturated fatty acid. So this would be an unsaturated fat. When you deal with carbohydrates and lipids, as well as with proteins, oftentimes you will see them listed on a nutrition label on any piece or any food that's sold in packaging. Now, the nutrition fact sheet that you see here is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And in this case, the total recommendation for fat is about 65 grams. Notice the total fat here is 12 grams. So you're about maybe 20%, 18% exactly in on your way in this case. Now, when you read a nutrition label, there's a couple of things that you need to pay attention to. The first thing is make sure you know how many servings there are per container. Notice the 2 here. When you buy one of those little bags of chips out of the machine in the lobby, all right, usually those little bags are 2 servings. Okay, so you look at the label and you say, oh yeah, I'm only getting 12 grams of fat. All right, but in reality, you're getting 24 grams of fat. You're doubling all of the calories and everything else. Notice they give you calories per serving as 250, but if you eat the whole bag, then you're getting 500 calories, right? So you have to be very aware of the number of servings. And by the way, I dare you not to eat the whole bag of that little bag of chips, which is mostly air anyway. Now, a percent daily value of 5% or less is low, and 20% or more is high. So when you look at a food label, you should make sure that you're falling somewhere in between, around the 10 to 15% range. You should try to avoid trans fats, which, by the way, in Albany County are illegal. You cannot go into a grocery store and buy Crisco anymore because they are trans fats, and the Albany County legislature knows better than you do about what you should be eating. Okay. Now, what is the food on the right? Well, if you read your textbook, if you've read your textbook, you'll already know that this is a food label from a box of mac and cheese. All right, 2 servings per container, 18% of your daily value of fat per serving, 20% of your sodium, that's a lot, 10% of your daily carbohydrates, and so on and so on and so on. Now, me personally, I would probably try to stay away from this food because I've got enough fat on me. But for my triplets, yeah, they're pretty skinny kids. So I'm always trying to fatten them up a little bit. And so I would definitely serve them this mac and cheese. Okay. This is a video on YouTube about how to use a nutrition label. I don't think you can access it through my video, but I'm going to post the PowerPoint to this, and you should go back and use that PowerPoint, call it up on your device, whatever it is, and watch this video, and it'll explain how to use a nutrition label for dietary knowledge. All right. Okay, so that ends the second of 3 videos on the chemistry of life. Please be aware that the next video will be posted shortly.